Good evening, welcome to MOTS presents MOTS Ado About Nothing.
MOTS Ado About Nothing. MOTS Ado About Nothing.
Where we apply the revolutionary MOTS scale to classic and contemporary literature.
MOTS Ado About Nothing. MOTS Ado About Nothing.
This podcast contains mature content, spoilers, language. You have been warned.
Hello, and welcome back to MOTS Ado About Nothing, Halloween edition. That is MOTS Ado About Halloween. So we are doing horror stories and scary stories and so forth for the season, and our first one is going to be a very classic, by a very classic horror author. It is The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. I am your host, Scott Thurlow, here with Veronica Hernandez.
Hello there.
Jonathan Ian Manzer. And Stephen Amosi.
Hello.
Alright, so E, can you give us a sort of condensed synopsis about what The Masque of the Red Death is all about?
In the shallowest terms, a bunch of nobles hide in this prince's palace from a plague.
It's just a plague-like plague. It's a great description, yes.
Called the Red Death, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, it's
Shallowest terms possible.
That is pretty accurate. And just a quick caveat, so because this is a very short story, we decided to condense the intro, body, conclusion in sort of one large conglomerate, and we'll discuss them all at once and then give the scores based on that. So we'll start with Veronica.
Alrighty, well, intro, body, conclusion. This story, as Ian so nicely summarized, is about a group of noblemen that are trying to run away from a plague, or hide away from it.
We're trying to ignore its existence.
Mm-hmm. So they go off and essentially have a week-long party, or what it seems like a week, that involves partying and foods and dancing, enjoying their time away from the plague.
If I may, this takes place 5 or 6 months into their seclusion.
Okay, correction.
Yeah, I think that is correct.
You're right, actually.
They've been there a while.
They are trying to ignore what's happening by staying away from it, and they end up finding themselves victim to that same plague, which somehow finds them. The introduction is just description. It's description of the plague, what it comes out to be, how it affects the victims, blood splatter, almost immediate
It's
death
the bubonic plague, but with red blisters instead of just black ones.
Yeah.
Actually, I was reading a bit of, I was meta-literary analysis of this. It was discussing all the diseases that Edgar Allan Poe had combined, like tuberculosis and certain, it's
that's interesting.
Huge number of different, it doesn't match anything one-to-one, but it's a compilation of all these different plagues.
All the plagues.
Plague-like plagues.
All the plagues.
Exactly.
So they run off into this secluded location, which has been decorated to the prince, who is the person who's leading all of this. And the description of the rooms are very vivid, almost costume-like, over-the-top, dramatic.
Yeah, it's a mask. That is to say, a masquerade.
Absolutely. But it's their living quarters, which is really affected. And I mean, the way that Poe describes it in the intro, the body, and even the conclusion, everything is very vivid, everything is bright, everything is super dark.
Each room has their own colors.
There's sort of themed rooms, or there's a green room, a blue room, a purple room, and so forth. So they're all sort of just decorated to that effect.
Right. So as the story goes along, it's describing all of these colors, the surroundings, and it comes to the conclusion where the Red Death actually finds them, and it's almost the person or the individual or the item or the monster, whatever you want to consider it. The way it is described, it's pretty much taking it one step further than what they think is appropriate, even though they are the ones that are off partying while everyone else is dying.
Yeah.
And then they all die with a very dramatic stabbing, is what it seems like.
Well, I believe they all catch the Red Death.
They start catching the plague and dropping dead.
So that's the intro, body, and conclusion for me. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else.
I think that what you were thinking of is the prince at the end has a knife in his hand, and he's about to strike
He attempts to stab
the personification of the plague or whatever.
The figure.
And when the Red Death looks at him, he drops the knife.
he drops a life.
Yeah.
Right.
And starts convulsing and dying from the Red Death.
Yep.
As the Red Death walks through the rest of the rooms and everyone else is falling.
I'll read it for you guys. There was a sharp cry, and a dagger dropped, gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterward, fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. So that's how he dies. But anyways,
Indeed.
yes.
So I have my biggest complaint with analyzing the narrative of this story is there's almost no narrative to analyze. It is more of a...
It's a scene, really, kind of.
Well, it's all description.
Style and thematics.
Right up to the end, yeah.
But every piece of narrative in here is in service of the theme or the style. Especially like not only are they different colored rooms.
I see what you mean.
But it's a chain of rooms from light,
the
spectrum of colors till it gets to the black room with the ebon clock that drowns out all of the, like, in a sense, the personification, or if a room can be personified of death.
Yes.
And like the inevitable fate all these people are going to go through. But again, we're going to get into it. Who's the protagonist? Who's the antagonist? It's a very short story about people facing their mortality, even though they're trying to run away from it.
Yes, no, I see what you mean. So I do agree that it may be difficult, but I have an affinity for this story. I sort of convinced Veronica to choose it, so we that's our joint choice. So just to be clear, full disclosure. But I would like to give it a good score, but you made a good point that it's all just basically a description of a scene and things happening. There are characters, yes, but they don't do much except die, really.
Well, understood, but isn't that description... Here's the thing, I've read stories where there's nothing but dialogue, and yet it doesn't give you the feelings that the description of the Red Room does in the story, like where it's... You are told that the characters that are going into the room either are brave enough to go in there or avoid it at all costs. And, I mean, what kind of dialogue? I mean, you can have dialogue, but just a description itself gives you those emotions.
Narrative movement. Because that joking synopsis I gave earlier was literally the whole narrative structure of this work.
No, I understand what you mean.
I'm not necessarily talking about dialogue. I'm talking about... There's almost... It's weird because, I just feel it's more towards thematics, more towards style.
And the other thing is, I think that all the narrative in this story is in the beginning and the end, right? There's the whole idea, there's the whole reason given for why everyone kind of sequesters themselves away, and it's the description of the Red Death in the beginning, and talks about how this, like, large group of nobles goes into hiding. And then the entire body, I guess, is just description of the castle. And then the end is where everything really happens. So, like, thinking about this, I think I'll probably still give it a 2. I understand exactly what you mean, Ian. But out of 3 points for this one, I think the intro and the conclusion do a good job. I think it's really well written all the way through. It's just that the body doesn't have much going on for it, I guess, or like, the middle chunk of this doesn't have much going on.
Yeah, I think you may have convinced me to do the same exact thing, because I would like to give it a perfect score, because I have, like I said, I have great affinity for this story. But I think that's true, Steve. Like, the sort of buffer, like the intro and conclusion are stronger, and they buffer. And yes, to your point, E, most of it is in service to themes and so forth that we'll speak about shortly. But I think 2 is a solid, respectable way to parse it out. So that's what I'll give it as well.
I'm going to give it a 3. I still think that it's strong throughout, even though it is very different, and maybe it's not as strong as you guys were saying. Through the body of it, it still kept my attention. I still wanted to read more and figure out what else is going on in this castle. What else is there besides these rooms? What is there besides this band? What is there besides all of these people kind of just wandering around to appease the prince in the story? This is all something that, yes, maybe there's not much to it as much as the intro and the conclusion, but it's enough where I felt to those standing in the middle of those rooms or with those people and seeing everything going on around me. It was enough that I feel convinced to give it a 3. I think it was strong.
For a similar reason that Veronica just outlined, I'm giving it a 2. Although I kind of want to give this a 1. It definitely doesn't deserve a 0. I think the strength of the work overall, and the fact, like you pointed out, Steve-O, that there is at least narrative setup and closure to that initial setup that I have to give it. I'll give it a 2.
All right. Which brings us to themes with you, E.
As I said, this is a work heavily about thematics. I think you can break down a lot of the different aspects that Edgar Allan Poe put into this.
Yes.
There's a lot of symbolism. I want to talk about a couple of things first, though, with like the idea of like classism. A group of nobles kind of hiding in this abbey. I think it's actually literally.
I think it's a former
cathedral.
abbey that he turned into a castle.
We'll talk about the religious aspects there in a moment, but you have the peasants are outside dying, while the nobles are...
Let them eat plague.
They have enough supplies to survive, or to, they think, outlast this plague. And they just need to distract themselves before either death comes for them or they escape it.
Sure.
And I had mentioned earlier about how each room kind of has that idea of progression from the blue light where Prospero sits to the black room, which everyone's afraid to go into, with the Evan clock. That's almost a countdown to people's deaths. That every time it chimes, it halts the music, it halts the revelry. A kind of reminder of, in a way, death ever present. You have the personification of the disease, who really has, I think, almost no. I don't think he has a line in this.
There was only one line in the story, and it's not from the Red Death.
And even his presence is offensive. And he ends up being, in a sense, the pale rider of sorts, bringing the disease with him. And I think there's a lot to parse out here. I think there's a lot more you can delve into this, but I think those are the broad themes that are discussed. No,
I pretty much agree. Like, of course, like the one that I always got of it, I think is the biggest that Poe intended it for, is like just a reminder of your own mortality. And like, sure, you can try to escape it, try to ignore it, distract yourself, and so forth. And yes, the classism point also stands, like, viewed through the filter of that in this particular one. But I still think, like, death is ever present is probably the biggest theme.
It's I think it's a combination of that. Like, death comes for everyone.
Yeah.
You might be. Damn it!
All right, go ahead. Say the line.
You might be a king or a lowly street sweeper, but sooner or later you dance with the Reaper.
Yes, exactly.
Well, to make a historical point off of that joke, actually, in the bubonic plague, like, entire castles would be wiped out, and like noble families would be gone, and that's this. I probably feel that this story was inspired by the fact that, like, the plague did not care who you were.
Yeah, right.
And
no, I mean, I agree with that, and of course, like, being reminded of your own mortality is, I don't need to be reminded of it, but it's always a theme that I gravitate towards. So, and I think Poe did a very good job of using that as a framework to tell a nice neat little scene, really, if you will.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with all three of you. I think that's a really strong theme in the story. I'm also a fan of the use of time through a lot of the story.
Good call.
Where, yes, it has to do with death, but at the same time, time goes so fast. And sometimes, regardless of what you're trying to do to escape it or ignore it or pretend it's not going by, it's still, the clock is, as you said, ringing every time the hour goes by, and everyone is silenced by that reminder. And he references, an hour down to the second and to the moment and the amount of time that they're there. Time has a lot to do with the story. And I think, yes, it goes back to death, but at the same time, time is a very scary thing, because 1 minute it's January and the next is December. I mean, even in the most basic term, it's a scary thing. You can never stop it. There is nothing you can do short of creating, a time machine to escape it.
Time and death wait for no one.
Mm-hmm.
But Veronica, to your point, to reinforce the point you're making, it starts off with them hiding away. And then it's a jump of 5 to 6 months. And then this party happens, which you're actually watching the hours every time. Like, he'll constantly bring it up over and over again, I believe, as you also mentioned.
Yeah.
But the idea is that, it has this countdown-like progression to the point where he's referencing the seconds left. So that is a nice tension builder.
No, I agree. It's a nice subtle little detail, but maybe elevates it a bit. But certainly, I'm going to give this a strong one, in fact.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
It's very well done.
Will I.
1, 1, 1, 1, 1.
And we are on to antagonist, Steve-O.
Hey, so...
I mean, talk about the antagonist. I wasn't calling you the antagonist.
I mean, well, wouldn't be the first time somebody called me that.
True.
I guess kind of the Red Death is kind of the creeping specter of death looming and personified as a person or as the chiming of the clock or the way that the black room is decorated and
yeah, sure.
tinged with red is kind of what I look at as the antagonist but the problem with that is that means you have to look at the prince and all these D-bags as the protagonists, I guess.
Steve, if I may interrupt for a second, you had referenced antagonist as what is antagonizing the protagonist in a way, or what's causing conflict for there. And when I'm skipping ahead to dialogue for a second, the only line of dialogue here, but I think it's very important for analyzing who's the antagonist, is that not only are they hiding away from the destruction on the outside and the people dying, but they're trying to purposely forget that the Red Death even exists.
Sure.
So when they meet someone that they think is dressed in a costume of a victim of the Red Death, Prospero, no relation to the Shakespeare Prospero, who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements. So even even like a reminder
the mere presence
of what
of
exists
it, yes, exactly.
outside creates the most like the greatest pain and anguish and anger from Prospero, who's probably the protagonist of this story.
Yeah, I think you may have convinced me. Like, I sort of wavered about this one. Like, of course, facetiously, but also not. Like, death is the antagonist because that's always going to be true, pretty much of any like humanistic story. But like specifically in this one, and I think you made the tail end of your argument. I think has swayed me to that viewpoint. So I'll have to view it that way and score it as such.
I don't know. I'm not sure how I'm going to score this one yet. I think it's strong. I think it's well done. Well, I don't know. Veronica, got anything?
Yeah, I'm trying to jump in there for you.
Help me out.
So, yeah, I have to agree. What you were originally saying was that it's hard to call the Red Death the antagonist when you, at the end of the story, are cheering the antagonist on, which is fine, because really, if the prince is the protagonist... I wouldn't say I was
cheering him on or anything, but I like that use of phrase.
That's certainly what I was doing by the end of the story.
Fair enough.
I mean, yes, Scott's right. Death is always going to be essentially the bad guy, as in simple terms say it. But I think that the Red Death does fulfill that role, that purpose, regardless of whether we like it or not, or whether we want to call the Red Death the protagonist or not, whether we like what comes out of them being the antagonist. I mean, I still would call the Red Death the antagonist, and I would score it at a 1 because it's a smooth, it's not abrasive, it's not in your face, it's coming. That's pretty much throughout the whole story. You're waiting for it to show up, and it does it very well, subliminally, but it does it very well. The Red Death, I'm not even going to say it's a he, but it serves its purpose.
Pestilence personified.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
Also, just that disease means something different in our world than it did in Edgar Allan Poe's world, where Edgar Allan Poe died of syphilis.
Well, they're not sure what he died of, actually.
Could be any number of things.
But disease was a much more prominent thing in their existence than it. We still have terrible diseases in our day and age, but it isn't the overwhelming fear
specter,
of it that,
if you will,
that it existed during his. So,
no, I mean, I agree, and I'm definitely going to give it a 1. So
sure.
Yep, I mean, just for a moment, not to be devil's advocate, but what if we did consider the prince and them the antagonist as opposed to the Red Death?
I would still give it a 1. I mean, is that what you're asking?
I'm just wondering, would your opinion be, do you think they've delivered, if we did do that switch, if we didn't, if we begrudgingly are naming the Red Death the antagonist, and instead we name the people and the prince the antagonist?
You are welcome to offer a different antagonist and vote it as such. That has precedence in our show.
You don't have to per se choose that, but I think
here's the thing: the story is told from their point of view. The Red Death. The Red Death
third-person omniscient narration.
The Red Death is a outside force that comes into this story. You're definitely not seeing the story from the point of view of the Red Death.
I guess that's
that
yeah.
way.
All right, fine. That's a fair point. Yes.
Valid.
Well, by the way, I'm still sticking with it, and I'm giving it a 1.
Giving it a 1 as well.
Agree.
Agreed.
Right. So that's interesting because it brings me to protagonists. So, like, I don't even know if I want to say begrudgingly, like, because of that, I guess because of what you just said, Steve-O, more or less, and sort of what also, Veronica, you just touched on, that, yeah, I guess Prospero and his partygoers are it, or even, like, maybe Prospero himself, and then we can get into, like, them as, like, just secondary props.
Yeah, that's what I was
really
going to say, I think.
I would actually argue that it's the entirety of the group, and Prospero is
He's them personified.
Well, he's their
The
he's
mouthpiece.
their voice,
Yeah.
but literally as the prince, but also in the narrative of the story, he represents them as a whole.
Sure, no, I think that's well said. That's a good point as well, and I agree with it. And for that, like, I think it's two sides of the same coin in a sense. Like, as strong as the Red Death as antagonist is, it's against them. And yeah, you may not like them, you may like resent them for trying to, as I said, let the peasants let them eat pestilence while we hide ourselves away and have a huge party for months and months and try to forget that, you know, a disease is ravaging the land, coldly uncaring about whoever it is murdering, because hey, we're fine. Let's have a band. Let's let's dress up. Let's have a fucking masquerade. So I mean, like, but all that to say that I think they're equal forces. It's like, you know, the unmovable object versus unstoppable force. So,
but they ended up very movable at the
yes,
end.
right. But it's like it's set up. You know what I mean? I'm using that as a metaphor here. So I think I'll give them maybe a softish 1, but still, you know, decent overall, because I think they serve their point in the story and the narrative and for what they're supposed to represent, I guess I want to say.
I think you're right, Ian. Like, this doesn't solely follow the prince. It definitely is kind of from the point of view of the entire group. I'm trying to think what that's going to leave us for supporting characters, but
the rooms.
But I think you're right.
Well, don't get there yet.
And I think they are strong protagonists, especially for a short story. It's not that you don't have to like them for them to be a good part of the story.
That's something we said before a number of times.
You don't even necessarily. Yeah, you don't obviously need to like the protagonist, but which I didn't. They were still a good personification of what they were supposed to be. This idea of the nobles going off on their own, and they personified that really well as a group.
No, I agree. So,
Yeah.
Is anyone not giving it a 1?
No, and I'm going to agree with the three of you. I think that it is not just the prince as a whole. Poe always leaves me somewhere between mad, frustrated, scared, or just exhausted. But with this particular, question, who is the protagonist, I think that, the group as a whole, because while, yes, the prince is the mouthpiece to all of them, we're seeing what he wants to see, the rooms, the castle, everything is decorated and set up according to what they all want to see, what they all want to enjoy, the only thing they want to see and what they enjoy. And yes, they are, who is antagonized. So, I mean, I'm going to give it a 1 because whether I like them or not, they, like Steve-O said, they did it very well.
Yep. Alrighty, which brings us to secondary, which is, I guess, an odd, another one to discuss. On to you, Veronica.
As Scott said before, I'm going...
So, did I steal your answer?
You did.
I said that rather humorously, but you can elaborate.
Well, I mean, just consider this. Because I was, at the very beginning saying how, the body may not be strong in certain things, but the rooms do play certain personalities, certain points of view, and, that in and of itself can be a character. And I think that they do very well in supporting characters and, underlying themes that we were talking about. One is bright and happy and jolly and all of this. And then others are dark and red and boding.
Well, just one,
whatever.
But it does exactly. Go down the line from
exactly.
pleasant to less pleasant.
And I think that those secondary, they were supportive or secondary characters because I think it set the tone. It changed people's feelings when they were in the room or out of the room.
That's a good point, yeah.
People were changing, and I think that they were affecting the protagonists enough that they should have some sort of play as a supportive or a secondary, even though they're not individuals.
No, I quite like that, and like I said, I sort of jokingly said that, but I think you are right, and perhaps we can expand that. Consider this, the entire setting, the castle itself, perhaps. Like all the accoutrements, if you will, the band and so forth, could be technically considered. But I do like
the clock.
Yes, exactly.
The clock, yes.
That's a good one. The dagger.
You've just made all my arguments for style. I don't think there are any supporting characters in this. Maybe you want to argue the band or the servants, the non-noble people who make up the protagonists, but they almost have no...
No, they're definitely background props, like that specifically. But I do like I think I'm going to go side with Verno on this one.
I'm going to be the
All right. He's going to be the Red Death himself and object. What do you think, Steve?
I don't know. I think I'm going to probably side with Ian on this one.
All right.
It's,
I'm just trying to give Poe as much credit as possible, obviously.
Well,
but I still like... go ahead.
Just, I don't think you need necessarily, especially in a short story, supporting characters to make a good story. Which, obviously, I really like this story, but there's not... I mean, I guess the band is probably the best
the closest thing that comes to you.
And it's not all that...
Not quite enough.
There's
I see what you're saying.
There's nothing really there.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
You know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm probably going to give it a 0
all right.
for this.
Is the thing, to elevate protagonist to a 1, I felt I needed to include
all the supporting
characters.
I get you.
So this has to get a 0.
That's completely fine, yes.
And that's, I mean, I can understand where both of you are coming from, but I still feel as though, even though you felt that the body was weak, I, on the flip side, think that it was very strong and it gave as much an effect and, changed a lot of things in the story as much as any of the supporting characters in the flock of sheep that were in the story.
It's all fine.
I mean,
how dare you have a different opinion?
I'm just saying, I mean, again, valid points, but again, that just goes back to the original.
Who dares insult us with his blasphemous mockery? But is that everybody? You got anything else to say about secondary, anyone?
No, I think that's it.
All right. Which is funny because that brings us to dialogue with the...
I already read the one piece of dialogue
yes.
in the story. I happen to like the dialogue, but I would, if you want to argue the narrator point of view, or more so the narrator representing the discussions and the actions of the protagonists in this, I think he does a very good job. So I have to give it credit for it. And I have nothing much more to say about it.
Yeah, I think that on something like this, you kind of have to look at the sense of conversation that you get when you're looking at dialogue. And
is that right? Well, you go on, and I have something specifically to argue with you about, Steve-O, but go on first.
Are you going to bring up the eye again?
No.
Okay. There's a feeling you get as you read this story of, how these characters are interacting. You feel the conversations that they would be having, I think. And I think this does a really good job. And I like the one line of dialogue that's in it as well. So, I mean, I think that's where its strength comes from, is this idea that you are placed into this party and you kind of feel, or at least while I was reading it, felt like I could get a feel for what conversations were happening, how the dialogue would be moving, through a place like this.
I have nothing to say against that, but I will have to bring up, it's not quite a 1-to-1 ratio, but check out our episode of It's Such a Beautiful Day, because on that one, I argued for the entire narration of the film to be dialogue, as well as the actual dialogue, and you were rather staunchly against that, as I recall.
Fair enough.
It seems like you're arguing my exact point in this case, which, as I said, sure, it's not quite the same thing, but I'm going to give it a 1 just based on the actual line of dialogue. But I would have made the same case you just made if you were making the case you had made earlier from the opposite side. That's all I'm saying. So, that's all I have to say about that.
Well, that's a nice recap there, Scott. I'm going to give it a 0. I enjoyed the line, but do I think it could have been better? Do I think
you could write it better than Poe?
Well, I wish. But I don't think the dialogue was strong in this. In fact, if it was up to me, and again, from my previous comments, had there been no dialogue, I would have been okay. He would have probably been able to describe the scene in any other way without any dialogue, and I think it would have been stronger for lack thereof.
Maybe. I mean, I see what you mean, but I'm going to give Poe all the credit that I can.
Sure.
I liked it, like, yes, sort of like Orson Welles, who dares mock us? But it made sense for the story, and I felt that Prince Prospero would say that when confronted with this figure.
You sure? I just don't think it's needed, and I don't think
mean,
it was substantial enough for me to give it a 1.
Yep.
So, at least for me.
I get it. I completely
I'm
get
going
it.
to give it a 0.
Well, I'm gonna leave it at my hypocritical 1.
Fine. Hypocritical 1s are totally fine, and that brings us to style with you, Steve-O.
brilliant style in this. It's Edgar Allan Poe.
EAP, if you will.
Yeah, it's Edgar Allan Poe. This is probably the easiest one in here. It's just great the way that he describes the rooms, the clock as this constant reminder. The people and their, kind of callous ways are described perfectly, and obviously, the specter of the Red Death at the end. It's really terrific.
Yes, I agree. I'm going to read the last line of, here's my Exhibit A, Poe's Genius. And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. The end. Did not write the end, of course, I added that. But I fucking love Edgar Allan Poe. His style is amazing. He just has such a, again, I've used his description, but I think he sort of is in the top echelon of writing prose as if it were almost poetry. And he also wrote poetry itself. So, and I know Veronica's a big appreciator of something like that. So yeah, I think probably the easiest and strongest one to give is style for this story.
Yeah, absolutely. I was jokingly commenting before we started the podcast that if I met someone that spoke the way that Edgar Allan Poe can write, I could probably sit and just stare at them adoringly for hours. Yes. Just please keep talking. I need to go to the bathroom. Just say it Poe style, and it's fine. I don't know. He has a style. The way he writes, absolutely, it's like poetry. It's beautiful and it's brutal and it's smooth and it falls off your tongue, so nicely. It's just, he's got great style. It's a solid one.
Damn right.
Mm-hmm. I think any description that I could give to Poe's style would be doing a disservice to Poe. And we have talked about how this entire work really is as you said, Scott, the upper echelon of style and poetry in prose. And there's nothing much more to say than that. Read it, because that will be a much better exhibit than anything we can actually give.
Yeah.
I agree. That's well said.
Sure
I completely agree.
All right. And that brings me finally to recommendation, which technically I already did recommend it, and I still would again. It's probably my second favorite Poe story, just behind the Casca Amontillado, so that's my favorite. But it's definitely in the top 5, and possibly the second to my actual favorite. And I recommend to everybody, to get into the spirit of the season, etc., if you just want a haunting-ish story, read anything that he wrote, really. But this one specifically always stuck with me ever since I first read it. It was a nice little reminder to read it again. It's still fucking awesome, so.
I would also give it a recommendation. My reason is because Edgar Allan Poe, again, I can just go on and on about the way he writes and how good all of his stories are. This is certainly not, my top 3 favorite stories from him, but it's really good to see a writer try different storylines, different approaches to a same, gothic theme across the board, which he does, through all his stories. And while this may not be, again, my top 3, it's still something, because of his skill, that you should definitely read.
Totally.
This is a difficult question for me, because am I judging it on what Edgar Allan Poe story should I read? This would not be my first choice, my second choice. And what horror story should I read? Again, if that's even going farther away from...
Sure, I get it, I guess.
So, if you're a fan of Edgar Allan Poe, you've probably read this. If you're a fan of Edgar Allan Poe and you haven't read this, then you should go and read it. But for the average person, I would recommend Poe works before this, and enough of them that I have to give it a 0 of recommendation.
It's valid.
Wow, okay.
I do recommend this story. A, it's very short, very quick read, much like a lot of his fiction. B, it is quite good. Yeah, it's not my favorite Edgar Allan Poe short story, but it's up there. And I've read it and probably most of his more famous ones several times at this point. It's something. All of these are something that you can go back to and read again and get the same kind of enjoyment out of them, or perhaps even a little bit more as you get older. The first time I read this, I was probably 13 years old.
Yeah, I think about the same for me.
I probably get a lot more out of reading it now than I did then. But it's a different type of visceral feeling when you read it when you're a kid. It's more thrilling, I guess, when you read it when you're a kid. So honestly, I recommend you read all of his stuff, this included. So I'm going to give it a 1 for that.
A broad but still glowing recommendation. All right, so now everyone has scored it, and Veronica and I have given it a 9. Steve-O gave it an 8, and grumpy old curmudgeonly Ian has given it a 7, which gives us a 8.25 overall. So very strong, you know. I think it's, again, like a very top-tier story, like I said. And while it may not be everyone's favorite or highest Poe story, I still think it is worth a read. It's a very good, like I said, seasonal, sort of haunting-ish tale. And it's a quick read as well. So there you go. Check it out. And this has been a premiere episode of MOTS Ado about Halloween. I, of course, have been Scott Thurlow, as always, joined by Veronica Hernandez.
Have a good night.
Jonathan Ian Manzer.
Damn kids and your red deaths.
And Stephen Amosi.
Have a good night.
MOTS Ado about nothing. MOTS Ado about nothing.
Music by Chris Morgan.
Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow.
MOTS Ado about nothing.
This has been a Los Angeles production. All rights reserved.